Hi, my name is Maddie Sleeth. I will be presenting my data visualization final project. So this project will look to introduce the data, establish the problem, identify the motivation behind solving the problem, explain the approach, reveal the results, and discuss future work. So, introduction to the data. A little over 2 years ago, COVID-19 spread across the United States, affecting every industry and forcing businesses to immediately adapt to keeping their employees safe. So, cities across the United States saw a majority of employees transition from the office to working from home, and the transition back to the office has been slow. This exploratory data analysis will investigate secondary data from Castle Systems. It's a security management system utilized in over 2,600 office buildings in major cities across the country. This data covers office occupancy of employees in the 26,000 buildings that the company services. Since the start of COVID, this company has been analyzing and publishing office occupancy data in 10 major cities in the United States by collecting data on keycard fob, and app access for employees working in those buildings. So those cities are New York, Dallas, Austin, Houston, Washington, D.C., Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Jose, and Philadelphia. And the data that we will be looking at is from February of 2020 to March of 2022. And the motivation behind conducting this analysis is the desire to understand how COVID-19 affected businesses with employees in offices and how the dynamic of the work environment has changed since the pandemic started. So, establishing the problem, motivation, and approach, I established 3 hypotheses. Hypothesis 1, while occupancy will be down in all cities, not all occupancy recovery trends will be the same. Hypothesis 2, the top 3 cities with the highest average occupancy will be in Texas, while the 3 cities with the lowest average occupancy will be in California. Hypothesis 3, specific months can be identified as having high potential for low office occupancy. So like spoken about in the previous slide, that motivation behind these hypotheses is understanding how employees are transitioning back into the office across the United States, to understand how COVID has affected work environments, and to establish if offices will see 100% occupancy again. And the approach to this analysis has been through Python and Tableau. They were both utilized to analyze the data and then create the visualizations. So looking at some of the results, the minimum occupancy of the entire data set was in New York at 4% in April of 2020, and the maximum occupancy since the start of COVID was 66.7% in Dallas in March of 2020 as the pandemic began to send people home. So on average, Dallas employees have occupied the office 39.6%, making that city with the highest average office occupancy. San Francisco has had the lowest occupancy average at 16.6% over the last 2 years. This city also had the least significant difference in minimum and maximum occupancy percentage, increasing only by 24%. Dallas had the largest average increase in occupancy over the last 2 years, seeing a 52.9% difference between its minimum and maximum. So the bar graph to the right shows the overall average office occupancy for each of the 10 cities over the entire time frame of the data set. As displayed, the Texas cities Houston, Austin, and Dallas all make up the 3 highest average occupancy rates, whereas New York, San Francisco, and San Jose have the 3 lowest average occupancy rates. These averages will be utilized to help answer hypothesis 2 by establishing which cities have the highest average office occupancy and which have the lowest average occupancy. This chart can also be utilized to establish the first hypothesis is correct, that each of these cities are independent of one another when it comes to trending back into the office. And since each of these cities had 100% occupancy before COVID-19, the average occupancy over the entire time frame suggests that all of the cities are recovering differently, and that they have their own trends and they are independent of one another. Continuing with the results, We looked at a linear regression model for the office occupancy of cities with the lowest average throughout the time frame. So pulled were New York, San Jose, and San Francisco. And those three cities, like I said, had been identified with the lowest average office occupancy. The dependent variable is the office occupancy percentage, represented as a decimal, and the independent variable is time in adjusted weeks. An adjusted week is simply the number of weeks it is in the year, with 0 being January 1st and 52 being the last week of the year. The data is broken down into each year, 2020 through 2022, but it has also been displayed in chronological order, so it is easy to see the trend of office occupancy over the 3 years. Two distinct outliers can be identified and explained. Week 12 in 2020 is significantly higher than the others and signals the beginning of the office occupancy decline due to COVID. While it is significantly higher than week 13 of that year, it is drastically different from week 11 in 2020, which had occupancy at over 90% for all cities. That displays the rapid decline of office occupancy from week 11 to week 13 in 2020. The other significant outlier on these graphs fall in the 21st through the 51st through 52nd week of 2021. After seeing a year of steady occupancy growth, the sudden drop has the potential to raise some concern. This change, however, is most likely due to the Christmas holiday falling within that week rather than COVID having a sudden effect. It is easy to observe the difference of occupancy trends in 2020 versus 2021. 2020 had a slight positive trend, whereas 2021 has an obvious rise in occupancy as the year progressed. It should be noted that the COVID-19 vaccine was officially released in December of 2020, resulting in 2021 seeing a push to have employees return safely to the office. Next, we looked at a linear regression model of the top 3 average occupancy. So those cities were Dallas, Houston, and Austin. While the entire time frame trends positively towards an increase in occupation, a wave-like pattern is displayed as time goes on. So week 30 through 37 in 2020 and week 50 of 2020 through week 18 in 2021 and week 30 through 42 all saw significant decreases in occupancy, followed by a slow but steady return to the office. All this while maintaining an overall strong positive linear association. When breaking down the data to compare individual cities that have similar averages, this graph shows the differences in occupancy recovery. So while the differences are small, it does establish that even if the cities are in the same state, they are independent of each other, and once again confirms hypothesis 1. So the next results we looked at were the monthly occupancy averages for Dallas. To answer the third hypothesis of if we could establish lower occupancy based on specific time of year with the given data set, we looked specifically at Dallas. Below is the line graph that shows the monthly averages for the city's employee office occupancy. 2 time frames have been indicated with the brackets showing that the office occupancy fell below the average line of 40%. Between December and February, the average occupancy dropped down to 35% before rebounding, and then took another dip between April and May. April is the average low for the year at just 30% of office occupancy in Dallas, Texas. While there are only 2 full years of data, it can be predicted that occupancy could be affected in the winter months of December and January and the spring months of April and May. So this is just another look at that same data, but this is a tree map. It confirms what was already identified in the line chart, that the months of low occupancy are January, February, April, May, and December. This confirms hypothesis 3 by identifying the months that low office occupancy can be expected. So in conclusion, this analysis looked at the overall average office occupancy for all the cities to test 3 hypotheses. It drove It dove into the 3 highest and lowest cities to identify trends over the adjusted weeks of 2020 through 2022. It looked specifically at Dallas, Texas to predict when we could see a decrease in office occupancy based on months and the time of the year. And then you can see some key takeaways that are on this slide. So for future analysis, it could look deeper into national averages rather than diving into one specific city to identify national trends and possibly make overall predictions. But it is clear that this data can be used to predict potentially how office occupancy will look in 2022 and 2023.